Assalamu alaikum, namaste, sat sri akal, shalom and good day. You are listening to Awaz Community Radio. And today on the radio, we'll be talking to Chloe from the Proud Trust. Now, if you want to get in touch with us, give us a call on 0161 839 9817. We're on Facebook, just type in Awaz Community Radio or tweet us at Awaz Radio 122. Thank you for tuning in to Awaz Community Radio. Your host for today is Syra. And as I said, my guest for today is Chloe from the Proud Trust. Hi, Chloe.
Hi, Syra.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, it's nice to be here.
And how are things with you?
Good, busy. August is always a really busy month with Pride coming up, and we have a lot going on at work over that time. So yeah, it's good to be busy, but it's good to come here and talk about some of the work that we're doing.
Fantastic. So can you tell our listeners a bit more about what is the Proud Trust and what do you do?
So the Proud Trust is Manchester's LGBT youth organisation. We do so many things. We do work in schools with young people. We have groups for LGBT young people, so that's lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans young people. And even within that, we have lots of different group spaces. So some of the work that I'd like to talk about today specifically is our BAME group, which is for Black and Asian young people who are also LGBT. But we do so much work across the city and across Greater Manchester and the North West. So too much to talk about today, but yeah.
Well, you've come to the right place if you want to talk.
Good, because we have lots to say. But part of my work with the BME programme is to provide a safe and supportive space for young people between the ages of 13 to 21 who are Black and Asian and LGBT to be and explore what those identities mean to them, and to have a space where they can meet other people that have similar experiences. And the other part of the BME programme is to work with Black and Asian communities in terms of starting that dialogue really and getting communities to talk about gender and sexuality and better supporting LGBT young people within their spaces. So that's a big aim for the programme as a whole, to support people but also to get the community on board and having these conversations as well, because ideally, you know, we wouldn't need to have groups because LGBT people would feel safe and supported within all of their spaces. So yeah, it's a big task, but I'm enjoying the work. It's really great. I'm having really great conversations with people.
Great. And could you just offer a definition as well for LGBT for those listeners who are not familiar with the term?
Yeah, so LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans. A lesbian is a woman who's attracted to other women. A gay usually means men who are attracted to other men. Bisexual means attracted to two genders, bi means two. So usually we say attraction to men and women, or some people say attraction to your own gender and another. And trans means where the gender you identify with is not the one you were told when you were born. So we all get given a sex when we're born and people assume our gender. And for lots of people, the assumptions that we make are not how people feel. So trans is where your gender, the way that you identify now, doesn't match what you were told when you were born.
I'm really pleased you're here because you're going to be answering some questions that many of our listeners have about gender and sexual orientation. And can you offer a definition for sexual orientation and gender? I think the two get confused a lot.
Definitely, and I think because LGBT is clumped together and actually LGBT are quite different things within that. Sexual orientation, or some people say sexuality, is just who you fancy. So, you know, being straight or heterosexual is a sexual orientation. Just the type of attraction you have towards people, I'd say, is what sexuality means. And gender is about how we feel about ourselves. So some people feel like they are women, some people feel like they are men. There's people who feel like perhaps both of those identities they have, or some people feel like they don't have any gender. So gender is about the way that you identify with yourself.
And would you say sexual orientation is a choice? Is it a choice? Because this is something that many people ask.
I think there's a lot of people who think that it is a choice, and I don't believe that it's a choice. I think that we fancy who we fancy, and it's a choice to tell people about it. So, you know, I have a choice to say now that I'm a gay person. It's definitely a choice to talk about how we feel, but those feelings themselves, I don't believe are a choice at all. You know, if you fancy someone, that's just how it is. You know, we can't stop that. There's nothing that made us fancy that person. It's just who we are. So, no, it's definitely, in my opinion, not a choice.
Thank you. And some people have asked about homosexuality, which is liking people of the same gender as yourself.
Yeah.
Some people have asked, can this be cured?
I think a lot of people, all over the place have searched out for a reason behind why people might be attracted to the same gender. And I think that's because we're told that as humans we're supposed to be attracted to what some would consider the opposite gender. So if you're a man, you're told you're supposed to fancy women. If you're a woman, you're told you're supposed to fancy men. And so when people don't experience that type of attraction, it's kind of problematized by society and it's problematized by people. And I think that's what's led people to search out, whether this thing you fancying people of the same and different genders is something that can be cured. So I think that whole dialogue is quite problematic because it makes people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual seem as though they're these weird and strange people that need curing, and actually they're people who just are aware of who they fancy, just as straight people are aware of who they fancy. So I don't believe there is a cure. I don't think you can make someone stop fancying the type of people they fancy, just in the same way as you can't make someone fancy a different type of person. If you don't fancy men, I can't make you fancy men in the same way that I can't stop you. So I think there's a lot of conversation to had around that, because a lot of people assume that it is something that can be stopped and cured, and I don't think that. I think as humans we are so diverse. We're diverse in our colour, in our race, in our heritage, in our personalities, and I think the types of attraction we experience are within that diversity, and it should be celebrated rather than problematised.
And how many gay people are there? I think this is something that is often discussed by people, that they say in one room that there'll be at least one person in the room that is potentially gay.
I think it's a really difficult thing to say, really. I think lots of people have have made attempts to try and see how many LGBT people exist. And I think we're never gonna have an answer, because people don't necessarily feel like those words fit them. Not everybody's in a position to realise themselves that might be something that they are, or talk about it. People might not want to talk about it. So, over the past, throughout the past, people have maybe said around 10% of the population, but some people have said it's higher, some people have said it's lower. I think it's a really difficult one to answer, because there's so many people that haven't been given permission to explore their sexuality in that way. So people aren't encouraging people to question and to accept different types of feelings. As I said before, kind of society says you should be attracted to a different gender, and so I think we're discouraged from exploring that a lot of the time. So I think it's really important that we see people in the media and the representation of LGBT people increasing, because it does allow people that permission to identify that perhaps they don't feel like they're heterosexual, and I think that's really great. I think there's also limitations within representation. We definitely need better representation, and I think that feeds into some of our work with the BME programme. There's representation of LGBT people who are from BME communities is a lot fewer. It's got a long way to go. We don't have perhaps the same platform that has been given to white LGBT people. So I think it's really important that we fight to increase the representation of BME people generally, but also who are LGBT.
You're listening to Awaz Community Radio. Thank you for tuning in. And we're talking to Chloe from the Proud Trust. Now, Chloe, thank you so much for answering a question so far from our listeners. And another question from our listeners is, what kind of work are you doing with the BME communities who are LGBT?
Yeah, so as I said before, it's kind of two-hand really. So I also work on a project for adults who are LGBT and BME as well, called Rainbow Noir, which is a social and support space for BME LGBT people to just have a space where we are the centre. I think within a lot of LGBT communities, they can feel very white, or they can be populated more by white people. So if you're a BME person whose experience, whose heritage, whose identity is actually quite different to that dominant space, it can be quite difficult to access those spaces or to feel comfortable and at home and welcome within those spaces. So I think it's really important that we also create our own spaces where it is just for us and we can come together and share and meet other people and really feel a sense of connection and community. So the BME youth group and the BME adult group, I think, provide that space for people. Some of the work we're doing within BME mainstream communities, I guess, is talking to people who are not LGBT about perhaps why Black and Asian communities are less used to talking about gender and sexuality. And I think a lot of people are aware that people assume that Black and Asian communities are more homophobic, and I don't think that's the case. I think it's really complex, and I think there's lots of things that kind of have been unaddressed that really need to. So a lot of my work is trying to have conversations with people about why they don't talk about these things and what are the barriers to talking about gender and sexuality within Black and Asian communities. And the response has been really, really positive. We've trained 30 Black and Asian youth and community workers who all wanted to learn more about this topic and wanted to know more about how they can support LGBT people. And within those conversations, we explored why people think BME people are less likely to talk about sexuality and gender, why people think that we're more homophobic, and actually how to start addressing that within our own communities. And what I found and what the project is focusing on is allies, because allies are so important. You know, I meet Black and Asian people, some people have faith, some people don't, all over the place, who are so supportive of LGBT people, who are so accepting and understanding, and yet all of those feelings of support and understanding aren't necessarily reflected or talked about in community spaces. And so, you know, there isn't the role models to give us permission to talk about this necessarily, and that's what I'm trying to encourage, really. I'm trying to encourage people who are open and accepting to be having those conversations in communities, because I think we do need those role models to give us permission. I don't know, Sarah, have you had any experiences yourself within your community about gender and sexuality and how it's spoken about?
I agree with you. I think sometimes, especially when religion and culture come into play, it is difficult to talk about these things. There are still so many existing taboos. There are many taboos. It's, you know, you've got communities at the moment, especially some of the South Asian communities, trying to talk about terrorism and extremism and radicalisation. Again, which they're now opening up now and talking about it more, which is great. But there are obviously still taboos like sexuality and gender, sexual orientation. And I have to be honest, I don't think I've known anybody LGBT from the ethnic minorities, maybe partly because of religion, culture, and I think it's still something that is still an issue within many white communities. Do you think? Also, it's still seen as, I think compared to 20 years ago, it's not seen as big a deal to come out, in inverted commas, to say that you are not heterosexual, you are of a different orientation. But I think it's still something that white communities are tackling with, and perhaps that's why other minority communities are a little bit further behind. Potentially.
I think it's such a complex issue. I think you know, as BME communities in a space, in a world that is white, that is a white-centred world, I think it's really important for us to hang on to and celebrate our cultures and our traditions and our faiths and things that really attach us to our homelands and give us a sense of purpose and being. And I think sometimes within that, the ways that we interpret culture and faith and religion and tradition can sometimes shut out these conversations. And I think sometimes we feel scared to question culture and tradition because it's so important to us. But I think tradition and culture evolve and change and have always done that. And it feels like perhaps some of the conversations around gender and sexuality, who people fancy, how they relate to themselves, have been missed out of that shift and change. And I think, you know, people need to be okay or be encouraged to be okay with talking about these things. I think there's a lot of fear surrounded talking about gender and sexuality within some of our communities, and I think there needs to be more people giving people permission, because I myself know so many people in Manchester who are Black and Asian and LGBT and are completely happy with their lives, and I think that's really important to talk about as well, because so often we hear the horror stories, the people who've been thrown out, the people who've had really horrible experiences with families and communities, and actually there are so many Black and Asian people in Manchester, people of faith, people of no faith, people who are still in their BME communities, who are out, who are open about their sexuality, and they're celebrated, they are happy. And I think we need to also talk about that as well, because it's not something that should be kind of brushed away and kept under the carpet. We are living, and people for as much as there are lots of people who have a difficult time and who can't come out because they fear of perhaps what would happen in their communities or families, there are lots of people who have come out and who have had really supportive Black and Asian families. And I think it's really important to talk about that too, to give people that permission that, you know, they can be like that. You know, I think I was talking to a friend of mine who's Hindu, and he came out to his mum, and it took her, I think he said it took her about 5 years to kind of get to grips with what that meant. You know, she said to him that he had to get married and that would cure things, and he said, you know, you're forcing me into something that's actually going to make me really unhappy, and I am happy as a gay man. And it took her a long time to get on board with that. But actually it turns out that she is now one of these Hindu mums in the community that other mums of gay sons come to for advice and to talk to. You know, she's put herself out there as a role model. She's given people within that community permission to talk about this. And I think it's really great that she's felt strong enough to be able to do that. And I think we need more people like that, because there are so many people who are accepting, but they fear of what the community will say to them.
Thank you for tuning in to Awaz Community Radio. Your host is Syra, and we're still talking to Chloe from the Proud Trust. Now, we've been talking a lot about labels, haven't we, Chloe? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender.
Mm-hmm.
And what are your thoughts and the people that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think it's difficult, labels, because they're so important to us. Having a label can be so important and empowering. And I think definitely for a lot of our young people, being able to label and define their experience is definitely really important to them. And I think really important for the world as well, to know that things are not really simple in the ways that we've been told they are. I think at the same time, on the other hand of that, you know, labels can be really restrictive and really quite just another box. And I think often when you say that you have a label, for example, I say that I'm a gay woman, you know, whatever that means to me is only I really know that, because everybody else will have an idea of what they think the word gay means. And so that's where labels can get really quite complicated, because they're another way, and essentially of putting you in a box. And I think as human beings, we aren't that simple. Our lives are so diverse and complex that putting ourselves in a box that very rigidly states who you're attracted to, I don't think really works. But it's just so difficult, because I think labels are really important until we have equality as well. You know, I think if we lived in a world where nobody cared who you fancied, if from the minute you're born it wasn't, decisions like that weren't made about you, about your gender and about assumptions about who you might fancy. I think if we didn't have any of that, and it was very more open in terms of whoever you fancy is just whoever you fancy, we wouldn't need these labels. But I think until we reach equality, naming our sexuality and our gender, and talking about the oppression that we do experience, and homophobia, biphobia and transphobia that society inflicts upon us, until that ends, we're always going to need those labels. You know, they're really important, I think, in this time. So yeah, it's difficult. I feel like positive for them and negative for them. But I think what is important, especially with our young people, is that they are given a language that empowers them. And I think that's really important.
Now, this relates to labels. Now, there's one question that some of our listeners were interested in asking you, was that what does it mean when a married person announces that he or she is gay?
Yeah.
And they're asking, isn't that a type of change in orientation? Now, again, it is going back to labels, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that example could be so many things. I think our lives are a lot more fluid than we're told, or that we're led to believe. And, you know, my labels have changed throughout my life. I went through a period of thinking when I was a child that I was straight. I really fancied boys. I had a period of life thinking that I'm attracted to both genders or two genders. And I'm at a period in my life now where I've just accepted that my sexuality is fluid, and a box doesn't really define that, and I'm open to that changing. And I think for a lot of people, their sexuality and the types of attraction they experience is fluid, but we're not given permission to explore that a lot. I mean, in the case of somebody who's married and then coming out as gay, I think that can be quite difficult. I think some people are pressured into being married, because people think that's the thing to do, or that will be what brings them happiness, or that's what their community or family wants, and actually that might not be what they want. So I think for some people it might be something that during their marriage they've realised that they're attracted to different types of people. For some people they may have known before their marriage. So I think whether their sexuality has changed is perhaps quite different to the marriage itself, because that person might also have felt for a period of their time that one label fit them, and actually maybe moved and kind of understood their sexuality in a different way. So I think if everybody could accept that our identities are fluid in their nature, whether that's attraction to people, whether that's the way that we feel and identify and dress, I think our lives are so fluid, but it feels like gender and sexuality is one area that we kind of don't really encourage people to explore that fluidity. I think we understand that as we grow older we change, maybe our opinions change, our styles change, and I think us as people change as well. Our morals can change, the way that we view the world change. So I think definitely our types of attraction is part of that fluidity of just being a human.
There's one assumption or misconception that people have, which is about people who follow a particular faith, that doesn't equate with being LGBT. And some of our listeners are asking, are religious people anti-gay?
Yeah, I think religious people get labelled as anti-gay, which I think is unhelpful. And I think the ways that people interpret their faith is so vast. Some people interpret their faith and I think then use their faith in quite a negative way and try and encourage other people to follow that way of thinking about their faith. And I mean, I'm not a person of faith, but with people who I know that have faith, whether they're LGBT or not, it feels like the essential part of faith is love and humanity and caring for one another and not judging other people's lives. And I've met people who are not LGBT but who are really encouraging of this kind of dialogue. And I think it's just such a broad and quite a messy topic to really explore, because I think there's so many contradictions involved. If on one hand you're saying my faith tells me not to judge other people and is telling me to love other people and have compassion, and then on the other hand that person is then being homophobic, let's say, or being very horrible or shutting out a gay person from their community, there's a big contradiction there. So I think it's important to question those contradictions and question perhaps what our faith means to us. And question where our ideas about that faith has come from. Are we digesting what our parents or community have told us, how we have to be as a person of faith, or are we exploring and discovering what faith means on an individual level? And in Manchester we have many faith groups that are LGBT friendly. In Chorlton there's the Metropolitan Church, which is a really LGBT friendly church. There are interfaith LGBT groups in Manchester. There's a Muslim LGBT group in Manchester. There was a Jewish LGBT group in Manchester for a time. So, people of faith who are LGBT have existed for years and years and years. And people of faith who are accepting and understanding have always existed as well. So I think definitely being religious does not mean that you are inherently anti-gay. But I definitely think gender and sexuality needs to be spoken about more within faith communities, because there are lots of people who are sadly removed from communities or made to feel isolated within communities because they are LGBT. So I do think that there is already conversations happening, but I encourage people to question some of those contradictions that they may have in terms of the way that they practice faith. In terms of, if it's about love and it's about supporting one another and having humanity, I don't see how that can go hand in hand with then, pushing LGBT people out of that community.
And can you name any BME role models for the BME communities? To be honest, I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, Sarah, you mentioned to me the other day that the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland is a mixed-race Asian man, and he's gay. And I think that was news to me. Yeah, I didn't even know about that. So he's somebody who I think perhaps we've not focused a lot of attention on, Leo Varadkar. And I think I don't know too much about him, but I know that he is a mixed-race Asian man and he's gay, and the Prime Minister in Ireland. So I think that's definitely somebody to look up. I mean, even within the House of Lords, we have a person called Lord Wahid Ali, and he was somebody who's been very prominent in fighting for LGBT rights and human rights in general. I think he's also a businessman and an entrepreneur, but not many people know about him. Even people, if we look back at the civil rights movement, people know who Martin Luther King is, and not many people know that his right-hand man, Bayard Rustin, was an out black gay man, and he did so much for the civil rights movement. And I think within LGBT communities, some of us are starting to talk about him now, but he was somebody that, the big speech, that I Have a Dream speech that Martin Luther King delivered, that march, the March on Washington, was Bayard Rustin was a massive part of putting that march together. Without him, I don't even know whether that march would have happened, and yet his name and his life has almost been removed from history. So Bayard Rustin is definitely somebody to look up. Angela Davis, a big civil rights activist, is a gay woman. And even if we look to the UK, we have people like Asifa Lahore, who is a trans woman, who's involved within fighting for LGBT rights and increasing the visibility of Asian LGBT people. Our good friend Sabah Chowdhury is a youth worker in London and does speeches and has done a TED talk all over the UK, and he's a brilliant youth worker but also advocate for LGBT rights. The very first footballer, in fact the only footballer who's a man in the Premier League level who has ever come out, was a black gay man called Justin Fashanu. And I think football, there's a long way to go in terms of challenging its homophobia, but a lot of people forget that he was the very first footballer to come out in the 90s. He sadly took his own life, which in part was due to the amount of homophobia and racism that he experienced. But he's such an important person for football and for BME people to know, that we are LGBT and that we can be. But yeah, we forget to talk about these people. Paul Sinner from The Chase is a gay man. So I think, it's really important that we're aware that LGBT BME people are everywhere. And we need to platform them and speak about them because, as a young person, when I was growing up, I didn't really ever know any BME LGBT people. And for me, that kind of meant I had struggled with accepting my identity because no one it wasn't reflected anywhere. I knew a couple of LGBT people, but they were white, and I felt like that experience didn't reflect mine. So I think it's really important that we are aware that BME LGBT people have always existed, that they are everywhere. And I think if one message I'd like people to take away with today is that, within our communities there are LGBT people everywhere, and I think we can't hide that, we can't run away from that fact. And I'd love people to start having these conversations and accepting that and acknowledging that, because for me, being able to exist as myself, my whole self within my community is really important. And I think there's lots of BME LGBT people who aren't there yet, who perhaps feel like they can't bring them whole selves to the table. And for me, that's why we have our groups, that's why we're pushing this conversation, because people shouldn't feel like they have to run away to have a group and be themselves there. Ideally, we could be ourselves within our community spaces and feel free and accepted to be that way.
You're tuning into Awaz Community Radio with your host Syra, and we still have Chloe here from the Proud Trust.
Hiya.
Thank you to Chloe for coming in, and this is great, hearing so much about the LGBTQ communities in Manchester, especially the focus being on BME. And we can move on now to talk about Manchester Pride. It's coming up.
It's under 2 weeks away now. So over the weekend, the bank holiday weekend, so there's Friday the 25th to Monday the 28th is a big celebration in Manchester of being LGBT. It's a celebration, but I think it's also a reminder, the Pride started as a protest in the 60s. The Stonewall Inn was a pub in New York which was frequented by LGBT people, and there was frequent police raids to that place, and LGBT people were arrested and beaten up. And there was one night where they decided we'd had enough, and that's where the whole idea of Pride came from, the Stonewall riots, with LGBT rising up and saying that we don't want to be treated this way anymore. We deserve to be seen and treated as humans. And I think that moment, the Stonewall riots, which was led by women of colour, trans women of colour, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, has kind of sparked pride movements across the globe, really. So Manchester Pride is definitely a time to celebrate who we are, but I think it's also a time to remember that, you know, LGBT people still aren't free to an extent. You know, we have the law that protects us against prejudice and discrimination, but LGBT people are still experiencing on a day-to-day level discrimination. So I think Pride, whilst being a celebratory time, is also a time to remember that we still have a lot to fight for, and we still need allies aware of these issues and fighting for us and with us. So yeah, it's a massive weekend, and there's lots and lots going on, and it kind of kicks off with a parade that walks through the centre of Manchester city centre, and it has lots of LGBT community groups within that, and it's a space where people can just celebrate being them. It's a really special time, and the parade is something that I always really look forward to. And the Proud Trust always has a big float with music blaring, and we have a couple of weeks leading up to Pride where the young people decorate the float, so they get to put their own messages on there, and we walk in the parade as well. So there's a massive group of LGBT young people. You know, the communities in Manchester come out and watch and cheer, and it's a really important and empowering time for people. So anyone can come and watch that. It's free. It's a really nice time to show your support for people, and it's a massive event. You know, there's lots of big and interesting music to see, and people create costumes. It's a really great festival feel, I think, the parade. So our young people will be in there being loud and proud, and that's a really nice element to the weekend. But also something to mention is Superbia, which is a part of Manchester Pride that helps put on community events, and there's an organisation called UK Black Pride, which are based in London, and their aims are to kind of empower BME LGBT people. So we've kind of collaborated with them to put on a series of events over the weekend that are aimed at celebrating BME LGBT people. So there'll be some panels, there'll be films that explore and celebrate BME LGBT people's lives. We've got local performers singing, and it's going to be really great. So if people want to get involved with that, if they Google Superbia Weekend Manchester Pride, they'll find the information for that.
And that's what they need to use, isn't it? Just really use social media to try and find out what's going on in the area. Definitely.
And then if anybody wants to get in contact with us, so I've mentioned two groups today. We've mentioned the Proud Trust, which is Manchester's LGBT youth organisation, so we support young people. We also provide training for organisations as well to get them to recognise and realise how they can better support LGBT young people. But within our youth groups, we have a BME group, we have a young women's group, we have a trans group, and then we also have LGBT groups in the majority of the 10 Manchester boroughs. So we have a group in Stockport, Rochdale, Oldham, Manchester, Trafford, and then there were also LGBT groups run by other people in the other boroughs. And the other group I've mentioned today is Rainbow Noir, which is for people 18 upwards who are LGBT and BME. And we all meet actually at the LGBT Centre in Manchester, which is just off Oxford Road. So if you Google Rainbow Noir or you Google the Proud Trust, you'll find all the information of how to get there. And the community centre has a cafe. People can use that space within the week, and you don't have to be LGBT, which I think is really important as well. It's a nice space that is just inclusive and accepting of everybody, really. So I'd encourage everyone to come down and have some delicious vegetarian food in our really nice community centre.
So what are your contact details, Chloe, for our listeners?
Yeah, so if anybody'd like to get in touch with what we've been talking about today, my work phone is 07519 814 905. Or probably better to get me on email, which is Chloe, CHLOE, .cousins, COUSINS, at theproudtrust.org. And if you Google the Proud Trust in Manchester, you'll find our website as well, which has lots of really interesting information about all of the work that we do on, and how to get involved if you'd like to volunteer with us and like to know more about supporting young people. And if you're on Facebook, if you Google Rainbow Noir, which is Rainbow NOIR, you'll find out about our adult space as well.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for coming in and
thank you for having me.
Talking about the amazing work that the Proud Trust is doing with, especially with the BME communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we wish you all the very, very best with Manchester Pride.
Thank you.
And listeners, we'll definitely be talking to Chloe about making more shows, and we're hoping for feedback as to what kind of shows our listeners want. Mm-hmm. So hopefully there will be some more LGBT themed shows in the future.
Yeah, and I'd encourage people also to come out and watch the parade of Manchester Pride. It's such a big celebration, and I think if you are supportive or perhaps want to know more, it's a really nice introduction to maybe doing that. So yeah, it's on the Saturday morning at 1 p.m. and it leaves from just outside the Museum of Science and Industry.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chloe. You're listening to Awaz Community Radio. Now, if you have any questions about today's show or any other show that we do, give us a call on 0161 839 9817. We're on Facebook, just type in Awaz Community Radio, or tweet us at Awaz Radio 122. Thank you for listening, take care, and have a good day.